Hey guys! Tonight we step into the warm glow of Hestia's hearth, a space that smells of smoldering wood, softened honey, and faint incense, where even the most tempestuous Olympians pause for a moment of quiet reflection. You trudge through the marbled corridors of Olympus with me, the faint hiss of the flames echoing against vaulted ceilings, and you probably won't survive this if you think the gods are all thunderbolts and epic battles. Here, domesticity reigns. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time so we can imagine this fire's warmth stretching across continents. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The hearth is modest in appearance, but monumental in importance. It is the anchor of Olympus, a quiet epicenter amid a palace of dramatic gods. Hestia's presence here is constant, almost imperceptible, a flicker in the corner, the gentle stir of embers, a whispered guidance to a careless deity who might tip a goblet or forget the proper libation order. In the myths, she is described as the goddess of the hearth and domesticity, which may sound tame compared to the storm-slinging antics of Zeus, but historians still argue whether her role was purely symbolic or if she truly acted as a political stabilizer among the gods. Imagine her as the eternal moderator at a very tense dinner party, and yes, you might start to envy her patience. The room itself is a soft choreography of light and shadow. Golden rays from unseen windows strike polished bronze utensils, glinting like tiny suns. Hestia moves silently among them, offering small libations of olive oil to the flame, tilting her head as if the flicker itself whispers secrets back to her. Fringe accounts, like those tucked away in obscure Roman commentaries, claim she sometimes leaned toward a distracted god mid-meal and murmured advice in hushed tones, barely audible over the crackling fire. Whether these whispers were mythic storytelling or reflections of actual cult practices remains debated, but the image is deliciously comforting. The mighty, unruly gods momentarily humbled by the soft authority of the hearth. Step closer, and you notice the meticulous placement of utensils, plates, and tiny ceremonial bowls. Hestia ensures the embers are never too high, never too low, maintaining a perfect temperature as if the fire itself were a patient guest. Even the scent of the room is curated, a gentle balance of fresh-baked bread, aromatic herbs, and the faint tang of smoldering wood, an olfactory invitation to pause, to breathe, to recognize that Olympus, for all its grandeur, has corners of quietude. You might smile at the thought that the most powerful beings in Greek mythology had to rely on something as simple as good fire etiquette to maintain peace. Historians still argue whether these depictions of domestic precision are reflective of real social practices projected onto myth or simply literary devices meant to contrast Hestia's calm with her more dramatic siblings. But walking through the space, you feel it in a way no academic paper can capture. The subtle hum of order beneath chaos, the sense that the world's stability can rest on something as unassuming as a hearth. Fringe legends even suggest that tiny fire sprites lingered in the corners, invisible to all but the most observant, adding a playful energy to the room and reminding any wandering Olympian that their mischief could be quietly observed. You trudge further, noticing small offerings, a pinch of thyme here, a drizzle of honey there, all contributing to the ritualized hum of domestic magic. Hestia's movements are almost hypnotic, a slow, careful rhythm that seems to sync with your own breathing. The palace outside hums with the faint roars of distant quarrels, Zeus complaining, Ares sharpening weapons. But here, by the hearth, there is a calm oasis. You realize this is not just about fire or food. It is about mediation, subtle influence, and the quiet assertion of order. The contrast is deliciously human. While most myths depict dramatic battles, passionate lovers, or thunderbolts from above, Hestia's domain is a series of small, almost invisible gestures. She maintains continuity where chaos could erupt, balancing the whims of gods with a patience that would exhaust mere mortals in minutes. The fringe tales, some so bizarre they sound like bedtime stories, claim she could nudge a quarrelsome deity into introspection merely by the angle of a flame or the placement of a tiny bowl. Whether these stories were purely mythic or not actual cult practices remains debated, but the image is deliciously comforting. The mighty, unruly gods momentarily humbled by the soft authority of the hearth. So, here you are, standing beside an eternal flame, feeling the subtle rhythm of Olympus that most mortals never glimpse. The air smells faintly of charred wood and sweetness. The light flickers against gold and marble. And for a few moments, the world beyond this hearth recedes. Hestia is not shouting or lording her power. She is weaving it delicately into every gesture, every ember, every whispered suggestion. You start to sense that the very notion of power here is quiet, slow, and strangely comforting. And as you lean slightly closer to the fire, watching it dance and sway, the myths shift from grandiose tales to intimate, human-like habits. She offers a libation to a flame, nudges a mischievous god with a gentle glance, and maintains a calm that feels almost impossibly vast. You realize that Olympus, despite its tempestuous reputation, has been anchored by simplicity, a goddess, a hearth, and a careful choreography of daily care that echoes through time in ways both obvious and hidden.
You step away from the hearth for a moment, letting your eyes adjust to the broader palace of Olympus, and suddenly the scale of Hestia's influence becomes astonishing. You trudge through gilded hallways, your footsteps muffled against polished marble, and notice that even the most tempestuous Olympians, the ones prone to hurling thunderbolts or challenging fate itself, pause when they near her domain. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, a nod, a quiet lowering of the voice, a slight hesitation before interrupting the sequence of daily rituals. Historians still argue whether Hestia's role as a peacekeeper was symbolic, a literary device highlighting domestic virtues, or if her presence in myth genuinely reflected a form of divine social moderation. Either way, the evidence is in the stories, the small actions, and the repeated emphasis on her constancy amidst chaos. The palace itself seems to breathe with her influence. Golden sunlight streams through vast windows, striking marble floors and casting dancing patterns that mimic the flicker of her hearth flames. You notice that rooms dedicated to other gods, Ares' sparring chamber, Dionysus's wine-filled banquet hall, have a distinct energy, often chaotic and charged, but near Hestia's quarters, the atmosphere softens. Fringe accounts even describe tiny embers escaping the hearth at the center of her temple, floating as if on invisible currents, conveying messages of calm to any nearby deity about to erupt in conflict. You chuckle at the thought. Zeus, warlike and prone to temper, hesitating mid-argument because a tiny wisp of fire hovers innocently at his elbow. Hestia's method is astonishingly simple in concept, yet layered in execution. She maintains an unbroken rhythm of domestic rituals, tending the flames, offering libations, adjusting incense, and performing small, repeated gestures that seem almost ritualistic. Each act is deliberate, creating an undercurrent of structure that the gods, chaotic as they are, cannot ignore. Her influence resembles an invisible social network, a delicate lattice of expectation and custom that regulates behavior without overt command. And as you watch her adjust the angle of a flame or tilt a tiny bowl of oil just so, you feel the subtle power she wields, the kind that doesn't rely on loud proclamations or dramatic displays. Now consider the human lens. Ancient Greeks took note of these domestic practices and elevated them to myth, embedding their own social ideals into stories of immortal beings. You might picture Hestia as a goddess whose day is comprised almost entirely of these gentle interventions, a curator of calm amid chaos. Fringe sources describe her speaking in barely audible tones to the gods, offering guidance that sometimes nudged the outcome of major disputes. "Perhaps consider restraint," she might murmur as Ares flexes angrily, or "Your brother does not wish harm, only order," whispered toward Zeus. Whether these whispers existed only in metaphor or represented a real cultic understanding of divine mediation is still debated. You continue through her halls and notice subtle markers of social hierarchy enforced by etiquette rather than strength. Seats are positioned to reflect seniority, gestures of respect are codified, and even the proximity to the hearth conveys significance. Here you see that Hestia's power is relational, dependent on both the gods' awareness and their adherence to these rules. It's a peculiar vision. Might doesn't dominate, harmony does. Her control is soft, patient, and enduring, reminding you of human domestic structures amplified to divine scale. The rituals themselves are detailed and at times almost theatrical. Oil is poured into the flame with precise motion, tiny grains of incense scattered at regular intervals, bowls of offerings rotated methodically. Fringe stories claim she occasionally added rare herbs for extra potency. Small aromatic interventions meant to influence mood or even inspire temporary clarity in a distracted deity. The concept is charmingly practical and almost absurd. The goddess of domestic order is also, in her own way, an early mood regulator of Olympus. You might imagine the great hall filled with gods fuming over disputes, only to have the scent of lavender and frankincense waft through the air, softening tempers almost magically. Historians still argue whether Hestia's myth reflects actual cultic practices, such as rituals in city hearths that guided social behavior, or if the narratives are idealized constructs designed to communicate human values through divine allegory. Either interpretation reinforces her centrality. Hestia is the constant amidst flux, a model of moderation, patience, and attention to detail. And it is precisely this attention to small, repeated gestures that allows her to maintain peace, Olympus's own quiet social engineering, performed with gentle hands rather than thunderbolts. In this space, you start to notice subtle reminders of her broader role. Hearths in minor temples, private family homes, and even civic spaces echo her principles: order, attentiveness, and respect for ritual. You realize that Hestia's influence is not limited to myth. It becomes a metaphor for social cohesion, transmitted from divine example to human practice. Fringe tales even suggest that minor deities and spirits were trained by observing Hestia's conduct, learning subtle cues to prevent quarrels or maintain decorum. Walking slowly, you sense the rhythm of Olympus settling into a kind of measured calm. The hum of conversation, once potentially heated, now ebbs and flows with restrained energy. Even gods known for outbursts like Apollo or Hermes pause to offer fleeting gestures of respect. And all of this is orchestrated without a word of command, simply through Hestia's constancy, the meticulous tending of her flames, and the gentle assertion of domestic order. This is the art of influence, invisible yet palpable, subtle yet powerful. You pause near the threshold of a secondary chamber and reflect. The goddess of the hearth, often overlooked, maintains the balance of an entire pantheon through ritual, attentiveness, and subtle guidance. The mainstream mythic narrative rarely credits her for this quiet governance, yet her consistency is her power. And as you look around, you feel the almost imperceptible pulse of order radiating from her hearth, a calming influence that shapes Olympus in ways both mundane and extraordinary.
Step closer to the hearth now, the heat gently brushing your cheeks, the soft crackle of flames like whispered conversation. Daily rituals of fire tending are Hestia's domain, a sequence of gestures so subtle you might almost miss them if you weren't paying attention. You trudge along the marble floor, brushing past polished bronze utensils, and notice the way she dips her fingers into oil and lets a drop sizzle on the embers. The flame flares briefly, sending a tiny wisp of smoke spiraling upward, and you realize that even a minor adjustment in this dance could ripple across Olympus. Historians still argue whether these meticulous gestures are literal practices attributed to cult worship or allegorical hints at order and moderation in ancient Greek society. Either way, the attention to detail is mesmerizing. The routine is surprisingly structured. Hestia moves from bowl to bowl, ensuring that each offering, whether a pinch of grains, a drizzle of honey, or a sprinkle of fragrant herbs, is placed with precision. Fringe accounts whisper that she sometimes leaned toward a distracted god mid-meal, murmuring advice or gentle warnings, as though the fire itself carried her words. You can almost hear the faint echoes of these whispered nudges, carried on the soft hum of incense smoke curling upward. It's oddly domestic, this image of immortal beings pausing their celestial quarrels to heed a goddess whose power is expressed in quiet gestures rather than dramatic feats. Observe the tactile details, the way she tilts her wrist, the subtle rotation of a bowl, the gentle sweep of a brush along a soot-streaked wall. Each movement is deliberate, part ritual, part choreography. The fire responds, flickering in patterns that, according to fringe tales, communicate approval or caution to any nearby god about to act rashly. You can't help but smile at the idea that Ares, fuming from a minor disagreement, might glance toward a playful ember and, for just a moment, reconsider his aggression. These are domestic interventions scaled to divine proportions, and they work precisely because no one, not even Zeus, wishes to disrupt Hestia's carefully maintained rhythm. The hearth's sensory richness is part of its governance. Smells of olive oil, aromatic herbs, and faintly smoked bread mingled with the warmth radiating from the flames. Light dances across polished bronze and marble, casting moving patterns that seem almost sentient, responsive to the goddess's movements. Fringe stories suggest that minor spirits, drawn to these subtle cues, flitted along invisible currents, reinforcing her authority with silent observation. You feel in the back of your mind that this isn't just a fire. It's a living system of checks and balances, a delicate feedback loop ensuring that Olympus remains a little less tempestuous than it might otherwise be. Hestia's rituals also involve precise timing. Each libation, each sprinkle of oil or incense, corresponds to a moment in the celestial day. Fringe traditions claim she had a subtle signal system. The rise of a particular wisp of smoke or the shimmer of embers would alert a god that their moment to act had arrived, or that they should hold back. Historians still argue whether these details are purely narrative flourishes or reflect real ceremonial practices in Greek domestic worship, but the imagery is compelling. You can imagine a morning routine of measured steps, each one reinforcing calm, respect, and attentiveness in a palace that otherwise teems with chaos. Even small imperfections matter. Hestia notices when an ember strays too far, when a bowl tilts slightly askew, or when a god's gaze falters at the wrong moment. Each correction is subtle, almost imperceptible, but it maintains a network of order. Fringe accounts suggest she occasionally employed tiny symbolic gestures, an extra pinch of time here, a whispered word there, to restore equilibrium,
a method almost invisible to anyone not attuned to her rhythm. You realize that the art of her influence is patience, repetition, and the careful orchestration of the mundane into instruments of harmony. You trudge to a corner where the firelight flickers across a low bench. Here, Hestia pauses to rearrange offerings, aligning them so that the shadow patterns across the floor remain consistent. These seemingly minor adjustments matter enormously in her system. They signal attention, care, and expectation. Gods might quibble, argue, or threaten, but the visual and olfactory cues of the hearth create a constant, grounding rhythm that they cannot ignore. Historians still argue whether the mythic emphasis on these small domestic gestures reflect real religious practices or simply a cultural idealization of order. But walking through the space, the logic is undeniable. And as you linger, noticing the careful choreography of hands, the rise of incense smoke, and the gentle flare of embers, you sense the full depth of Hestia's method. She does not confront with thunder or command with fire. She guides, nudges, and shapes behavior through repeated, deliberate rituals. Her influence is pervasive precisely because it is quiet, embedded in daily life, and almost non-confrontational. You start to appreciate how minor, consistent gestures can exert power greater than any explosive display, an idea that resonates even beyond myth. Finally, you consider the fringe tales, a fire sprite nudging a distracted god, an ember's glow subtly guiding a tense discussion, whispers of advice carried invisibly through smoke. These stories, whether literal or allegorical, emphasize the subtlety of her techniques. Hestia's magic is not spectacle. It is consistency, patience, and the intimate governance of daily life. And standing there, you feel an odd sense of reassurance, the quiet authority of the hearth anchoring Olympus in a calm that seems almost miraculous in contrast to the drama surrounding it.
Further into the palace now, past corridors glimmering with sunlight bouncing off marble and gold, and the scene shifts subtly from private hearth rituals to the broader social etiquette of Olympus. Even immortals, fiery, unpredictable, prone to quarrels that could level mountains, adhere to unspoken rules when they gather near Hestia's domain. You trudge alongside them, noting the delicate dance of posture, gesture, and placement, as if each deity knows that their position relative to the hearth carries meaning. Historians still argue whether these depictions in myth reflect actual ritualized behavior in cult practice or are simply narrative constructs designed to emphasize Hestia's stabilizing role. Either way, it's fascinating to witness. Seating arrangements are surprisingly precise. Zeus, by virtue of seniority, occupies the central position, yet even he is careful not to encroach too close to the hearth, where Hestia's presence is strongest. Apollo and Hermes linger at respectful distances, adjusting their stances in subtle gestures of acknowledgement. Fringe accounts suggest that even minor deities, nymphs, river gods, and household spirits align themselves carefully, their proximity signaling allegiance, respect, or mood. You can almost hear the invisible currents of social negotiation humming softly through the room, guided not by threats or commands, but by the unyielding authority of domestic order. Observe the finer points, hands resting lightly on knees, feet positioned to show readiness yet humility, eyes flicking briefly toward the hearth as if seeking permission to speak. Hestia's influence manifests not in interruption, but in silent expectation. She does not need to raise her voice for a god to pause mid-sentence. Fringe stories describe her whispering to a distracted deity, and suddenly the timing of speech and gesture falls into harmony with the ritual rhythm of the hearth. It's a kind of invisible choreography, a social protocol that blends etiquette with subtle governance. Even the simplest acts carry weight. Picking up a goblet, bowing slightly before passing an offering, or turning to allow another god precedence all reinforce a system of respect that permeates Olympus. The hearth acts as both anchor and reference point, a locus where decorum is not optional. You notice the smells of olive oil, incense, and faintly smoked honey hovering in the air, a sensory backdrop that quietly reinforces attention and calm. Fringe accounts suggest that certain aromas were intentionally used to modulate moods, calming hot tempers or signaling readiness for discussion. Historians still argue whether these aromatics were part of real cultic practice or embellishments in mythological storytelling, but the image is compelling. Conversation itself follows unspoken rules. Interruptions are rare, and if a deity attempts one, they pause, as if the fire itself is reminding them to consider timing. Minor gestures, tilting a head toward the hearth, glancing at the flame, a light nod, serve as nonverbal communication, a language learned and repeated across generations of gods and humans alike. You trudge through this space and realize that etiquette here is not about civility for its own sake. It is an instrument of peace. The myths consistently place Hestia at the center, her quiet authority regulating behavior through the invisible gravity of expectation. And yet there are delightful quirks. Fringe traditions report small pranks or playful deviations, a nymph hiding a tiny ember in Apollo's lap to make him pause mid-speech, or Hermes adjusting a ceremonial goblet to test patience. These minor acts, though mischievous, function within the system, demonstrating both adherence and the allowance for playful interaction, a testament to Hestia's measured tolerance. It's charmingly humanizing. Even gods must negotiate humor, decorum, and domestic rules in tandem. The hearth also structures nonverbal hierarchy. Proximity indicates importance, gestures indicate respect, and the alignment of offerings communicates intent. You can almost chart the invisible social map. Those nearest the flame carry deference and responsibility, while those further away remain participants, but observers, learning the rhythm of expectation. Fringe sources even claim that minor spirits would sometimes mediate minor breaches, nudging gods back into alignment with Hestia's meticulous standards. You chuckle at the image of an invisible fire sprite gently guiding Ares' elbows back to his side before he upends a bowl of offerings. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on etiquette reflects actual worship rituals, pedagogical tools, or merely narrative devices designed to demonstrate the ideal of domestic moderation. Yet the result is undeniable in myth. Even the most volatile divine beings are subtly guided by the rules surrounding the hearth. You trudge past the table now, absorbing the ambient rhythm, and start to sense how deeply Hestia's governance is encoded into social interaction, not through force, but through constant, gentle structuring of behavior. And as you linger, taking in the careful placement of objects, the respectful posture of immortals, and the soft interplay of light and smoke, it becomes clear that etiquette on Olympus is inseparable from Hestia herself. Every gesture, glance, and breath seems to respond to her silent, omnipresent authority. In a place famed for chaos, she creates order with subtlety, patience, and a rhythm that feels both comforting and inevitable. The gods may rage and quarrel elsewhere, but here, social grace and domestic attention govern
now
all.
into the intimate corners of the palace, where offerings, gifts, and small ceremonies quietly reinforce Hestia's influence. The air is thick with the sweet scent of olive oil and baked grains, mingling with the faint tang of incense rising in gentle spirals from tiny bowls arranged with meticulous care. You trudge past these offerings, noticing the subtle details, a pinch of thyme added to a libation, a delicate drizzle of honey over an ember, the soft alignment of bowls so that shadows fall perfectly across the marble. These are not grand displays. They are minor acts of devotion and social signaling, each carrying significance that extends far beyond what meets the eye. Historians still argue whether these domestic rituals, reflected in myth, echo real cultic practices, or are symbolic devices emphasizing the goddess's stabilizing influence. Small ceremonies punctuate daily life on Olympus. A simple act like offering the first sip of wine to the hearth before drinking signals respect and acknowledges Hestia's authority. Fringe traditions suggest she occasionally added tiny secretive gestures, sprinkling rare herbs in the offering or whispering an encouraging word, ensuring that the gods remain attentive and that minor disputes dissolve before escalating. You can almost hear the faint murmur of these acts carried through the palace corridors, invisible yet potent, reminding everyone that power on Olympus does not solely belong to the boisterous or the mighty, but to the consistent, careful influence of domestic ritual. The range of offerings is surprisingly varied. Grains, honey, fruits, small baked cakes, and occasionally rare herbs appear in different combinations, depending on the day or season. Fringe sources claim that certain ingredients were thought to influence mood or temperament, a pinch of cinnamon to inspire calm, lavender to soften anger, thyme to encourage clarity of thought. You trudge past a small bowl, imagining it placed there as a subtle peacekeeping measure, perhaps enough to prevent a minor quarrel from escalating into chaos. These tiny interventions highlight a remarkable principle. The careful curation of the mundane can shape behavior and maintain harmony on a cosmic scale. Even gift-giving follows a protocol that is both practical and symbolic. Minor deities might present small offerings to Hestia to signal obedience or respect, and she receives these gestures without fanfare, incorporating them into her daily rituals with the same meticulous attention applied to tending the fire. Fringe legends describe playful variations, such as a nymph leaving a perfectly aligned flower atop an ember, an act intended both to amuse and to reinforce attentiveness. These small ceremonies function as social glue, embedding expectations of behavior into ritual, while allowing subtle opportunities for creativity and interpretation. Historians still argue whether such narratives merely embellish domestic ideals or reflect actual cultural practices observed in Greek households or sanctuaries. You notice that these rituals are never hurried. Hestia approaches each act with patience, turning each bowl, tilting each libation just so, arranging shadows and light with near ritual precision. The gods, even the most impatient, accommodate her pace, a testament to the authority embedded in routine rather than in force. Fringe stories suggest that the simple act of adding a few grains of a sacred herb could soothe Zeus's temper or remind Apollo of his own temperance, emphasizing that even the grandest powers are influenced by attentiveness to detail. Small ceremonies also reinforce hierarchy and social expectation. Seating, order of participation, and timing are all critical. You observe minor gestures, a deferential nod before passing an offering, careful alignment of hands to avoid disrespecting the fire, subtle adjustments in posture to signal attentiveness. The hearth, surrounded by these tiny acts of devotion, becomes the epicenter of social order. Historians still argue whether the mythological emphasis on such ceremonial detail reflects real cultic practices, a teaching tool for humans, or purely narrative symbolism. Either way, the underlying principle is clear. Influence and authority often reside in consistency, attentiveness, and the careful orchestration of minor gestures. Fringe tales further embellish the narrative. Some recount Hestia quietly nudging a feuding god with a simple placement of an offering, the flick of a flame, or even a whispered word, dissolving potential conflict without a single raised voice. You trudge through this idea, imagining the goddess, nearly invisible, orchestrating calm with patience and subtle cues. The humor of the situation is not lost. Ares, tense and red-faced, momentarily appeased by the scent of lavender and a precisely tilted bowl, is almost charmingly human in his reaction. And as you linger near a cluster of carefully arranged offerings, you realize the scale of her method. Hestia does not enforce peace through spectacle or coercion. She wields influence through repetition, attention to detail, and quiet orchestration of small acts.
The cumulative effect is extraordinary. A palace of gods, each with explosive personalities and vast powers, tempered, focused, and harmonized through domestic ritual. You feel almost instinctively that the lessons of her methods extend beyond Olympus, hinting at the enduring value of patience, attentiveness, and subtle guidance in human affairs.
Outside the palace now, leaving the controlled warmth of Hestia's hearth behind, and the scene shifts to festivals and public worship, where her influence extends beyond the private domain into city squares, temples, and communal hearths. You trudge along streets lined with olive trees and sun-dappled stones, the air heavy with incense, bread baking in communal ovens, and the faint murmur of priests chanting her name. Historians still argue whether these public rituals were primarily civic expressions of devotion or if they functioned to reinforce domestic norms across society. Either way, the sense of order and rhythm is palpable. Festival days on Olympus are orchestrated with a meticulous blend of sensory engagement and ritual precision. You notice long tables laden with offerings, fruits, grains, honey cakes, and pitchers of wine, all arranged with symmetry that mirrors the domestic care Hestia performs at the hearth. Fringe accounts even describe elaborate early fire dancing spectacles, with flames tracing intricate patterns meant to honor the goddess, while delighting spectators. You imagine mortals and minor deities alike watching these displays, learning, consciously or not, but calm, respect, and attentiveness are central to Hestia's ethos. The rituals themselves involve both subtle and overt gestures. Every libation, every grain placed on a sacrificial plate, and every bow toward the flame communicates acknowledgement of her stabilizing role. Even the timing of the ceremonies is precise, with offerings poured at designated hours and priests and participants alike monitoring the alignment of shadows to ensure ritual accuracy. Fringe stories claim that Hestia's flame could subtly adjust itself to indicate approval or disapproval, a kind of divine feedback loop that encouraged proper behavior without direct confrontation. Historians still debate whether such accounts reflect genuine cultic practices, symbolic storytelling, or a mixture of both. You trudge closer to a temple dedicated to her, noticing its architectural simplicity compared to the ornate shrines of other gods. Columns rise in orderly lines, hearths sit centrally, and spaces are designed for observation and participation rather than spectacle. Even minor spaces within the temple, small alcoves, side hearths, and quiet corners carry symbolic weight, suggesting that calm, attentiveness, and domestic order were as important to the gods as grandeur. Fringe tales whisper of hidden rooms where tiny spirits kept watch, reinforcing order with subtle gestures, ensuring that ceremonial precision was maintained even when human oversight waned. Offerings continued to play a central role in these public rituals. Grains, small cakes, wine, and rare herbs are distributed, both as gestures of devotion and as practical reminders of daily domestic care. Fringe accounts suggest that certain aromatic offerings, like cinnamon or thyme, were thought to influence mood, inspire clarity, or calm tempers, especially during large gatherings where multiple gods might interact. The mythology subtly conveys that influence often arises from consistency and care, rather than from force, a principle that resonates whether you're observing mortals or immortals. Even social hierarchies are enforced through public ritual. Proximity to the central hearth, timing of participation, and placement of offerings all communicate rank and respect. Minor deities and mortals alike observe the rules carefully, and the flame functions as a quiet moderator, ensuring decorum. Fringe stories describe mischievous spirits or playful nymphs temporarily challenging protocol, but each disruption is corrected by the subtle authority of Hestia's symbolic presence. Historians still debate whether these stories reflect ritual enforcement and practice, narrative embellishment, or a mixture of both. You notice that festivals often incorporate sensory cues, light, scent, sound, to shape participant behavior. The crackle of embers, the scent of roasted grain, the rhythmic chant of hymns all act in concert to maintain order. Hestia's public influence mirrors her domestic precision, small, deliberate gestures accumulating into significant social regulation. Fringe accounts even claim that certain shifts in flame color or smoke direction were interpreted as divine signals, guiding priests and participants alike. Walking through the bustling city square, you sense how seamlessly domestic ritual and civic practice intertwine. The principles learned by observing the hearth at home, attention to detail, respect for hierarchy, patience, and subtle communication are scaled to society. Hestia's presence ensures that chaos is tempered, tempers are calmed, and civic harmony is maintained even when her role is invisible to most participants. And as you pause, watching the golden flames leap from ceremonial hearths and the careful arrangement of offerings and participants, you realize that her method of quiet influence, consistent, attentive, and ritualized, extends beyond Olympus itself. Hestia's ethos is a model for societal order, demonstrating that harmony is cultivated through mindfulness, patience, and attentiveness to subtle cues, rather than through spectacle or force. In both private hearths and public spaces, her guiding principles ripple outward, stabilizing both divine and human interactions with remarkable finesse.
You step back into the quieter corridors of Olympus, leaving the public festivals behind. And now, the subtle drama of conflict mediation unfolds. Even gods known for volatility, Ares with his quick temper, Hera with her meticulous grudges, Zeus with his unpredictable bursts, pause near Hestia's hearth. You trudge along, noticing the almost imperceptible signals she employs, the gentle tilt of a bowl, a whisper of incense, the careful flare of a flame. Historians still argue whether these tales of divine mediation reflect real cultic understanding of social order or are literary devices designed to illustrate domestic virtues through myth. Either way, the subtle influence is undeniable. Hestia rarely confronts directly. Instead, she manages potential conflict through symbolic gestures that de-escalate tension. Fringe accounts suggest she might let a flame flicker a certain way, or slightly reposition an offering to draw a god's attention away from anger or distraction. You imagine Ares, muscles tense, sword poised, pausing mid-lunge because a tiny ember hovers in his periphery, almost as if it were a sentient presence, redirecting his focus. The notion is both humorous and deeply compelling, highlighting how control can be exercised without force, through attention, timing, and subtle cues. Her interventions are measured and continuous. A minor argument over precedence at a feast, a whispered slight, or a heated debate between siblings is tempered by her quiet presence. You notice how even Zeus adjusts his posture slightly, his tone softening, as he glances toward the flame, acknowledging an invisible but understood hierarchy. Fringe traditions add that she might murmur a single word so soft that only the intended god hears, nudging the outcome toward moderation without overt command. Historians still debate whether these examples represent genuine ritual behavior, allegorical storytelling, or an instructive model for human audiences about managing tension through subtlety. The effect within the story is clear. Peace is maintained not through power, but through attentiveness, ritual, and structure. The hearth itself becomes a mediator. Smoke patterns, the precise angle of light, and the careful placement of objects all function as nonverbal communication channels. Minor spirits or attendants sometimes participate, ensuring consistency, whispering guidance, or subtly correcting missteps. You trudge through this concept, picturing a delicate network of observation and influence, where every small action contributes to maintaining peace. Even gods accustomed to dramatic displays of power are influenced by the rhythm and consistency of these domestic rituals. Hestia's approach is also preventative. Rather than waiting for disputes to escalate, she maintains an ongoing rhythm of attention that precludes tension. Daily rituals, offerings, and the attentive care of the fire set expectations for behavior long before any potential conflict arises. Even fringe stories suggest that a mischievous nymph might attempt to provoke minor discord, only to be corrected through the subtle orchestration of light, scent, and movement, reinforcing Hestia's authority without confrontation. You begin to appreciate the genius of this method. Consistent, gentle management reduces the need for dramatic intervention. Even subtle communication carries meaning. A nod toward the flame, a repositioned bowl, a whispered suggestion all convey social and moral expectation. You watch Hermes, normally sly and impulsive, hesitate, considering his next words, guided by these cues. Historians still argue whether such mythic narratives reflect ancient cultural understanding of interpersonal conflict or merely illustrate idealized domestic values, but the effect within the story is clear. Peace is maintained not through power, but through attentiveness, ritual, and structure. Hestia's interventions often go unnoticed, yet their effects ripple outward. You notice minor deities subtly mimicking her gestures, mortals learning from the implied social codes, and even errant gods adapting behavior in response to these cues. Fringe accounts suggest some of her whispered advice was memorized and recited by priestesses in public ritual, translating her quiet domestic influence into civic and religious norms. You trudge further, observing that her methods blend sensory, social, and symbolic strategies. Light, scent, posture, timing, and arrangement converge to maintain equilibrium. Humor occasionally intrudes, a mischievous spark, a playful glance, but it reinforces the system, teaching both gods and humans that order can coexist with personality. You start to recognize the pattern. Consistent, small gestures, aligned with expectation and attentiveness, stabilize the most chaotic of spaces. Finally, you pause, watching the hearth's flames reflect across the polished marble. The room is quiet, the gods restrained, and the underlying current of social order, so subtle yet so pervasive, reminds you of Hestia's mastery. In Olympus, even amidst thunderous tempers and divine quarrels, calm is cultivated not by force, but by the invisible hand of domestic attentiveness, ritual, and quiet intervention. The lesson is clear. Influence need not roar to be heard. Sometimes the softest flame casts the most enduring light.
Further into the inner sanctums of Olympus, where Hestia's influence is most intimate and her daily rituals quietly ripple through the lives of gods and mortals alike. The corridor walls are adorned with subtle mosaics depicting hearths, flames, and domestic scenes. Sunlight filters in through high windows, casting dancing shadows that move in rhythm with the flickering embers below. You trudge along, noticing the way every detail is calibrated to reinforce calm and attentiveness. Historians still argue whether these artistic representations reflect actual domestic practices in Greek worship or are allegorical devices emphasizing moderation and patience, but the effect on the imagination is vivid. The hearth itself becomes a focal point for reflection. Hestia tends the flames with deliberate care, ensuring they neither roar too high nor dwindle too low. Fringe accounts describe her whispering guidance to distracted gods, using nothing more than the subtle interplay of light, scent, and motion to influence mood and behavior. You can almost hear the faint sigh of the flames, as if responding to her gentle coaxing, reminding even the most tempestuous immortals that the hearth commands attention. In this quiet space, power is exercised through patience and attentiveness, rather than spectacle. You notice small gestures that carry enormous weight. Bowing slightly before placing an offering, arranging bowls in precise symmetry, and adjusting incense smoke so it curls toward the ceiling rather than wafting chaotically. These are all part of a language of calm. Fringe sources suggest that minor spirits often assisted, nudging objects or light streams of smoke to maintain ritual balance. These tiny interventions might seem trivial, yet they shape interactions, subtly teaching gods about attention, hierarchy, and decorum. Historians still argue whether these descriptions reflect actual cultic practices or were narrative embellishments meant to convey social ideals. Even the sounds of the hearth serve as guidance. The crackle of embers, the soft hiss of oil hitting flame, and the occasional pop of a bubble in a honey libation all form a rhythm that the gods unconsciously recognize. Ares' fists relax slightly. Hermes adjusts his stance. Even Zeus tilts his head, as if listening to an invisible symphony of order. Fringe tales suggest that these auditory cues were once formalized into ritual instruction, with priests interpreting fluctuations in sound as indicators of divine mood or behavioral expectations. You can't help but marvel at the elegance of such subtle governance. The spatial arrangement of objects also communicate authority. Bowls, offerings, and incense burners are positioned to create a hierarchy of respect around the hearth. Gods approaching the fire adjust their posture instinctively, even if they don't fully understand why. French legends suggest Hestia occasionally placed a single rare herb or tiny flame in a specific spot to redirect focus, gently mediating potential disputes before they arose. Historians still argue whether these stories are literal, symbolic, or a combination of the two, but the principle is clear. Small, intentional interventions can have powerful effects. You trudge past the hearth and notice the interplay of light and shadow on the polished floors. Hestia's rituals ensure that patterns remain orderly, guiding attention and subtly reinforcing decorum. Fringe accounts describe mischievous spirits trying to disturb these patterns, only to be corrected by minor shifts in flame or smoke, a playful but effective method of maintaining equilibrium. The gods, despite their immortality and grandeur, respond to these cues, demonstrating that authority need not be loud or aggressive to be effective. Her influence extends beyond immediate observation. The rhythm established at the hearth informs wider behavior on Olympus, shaping conversations, seating arrangements, and even timing of actions. Fringe stories recount that her attentiveness influenced major decisions indirectly, nudging the course of events without overt intervention. You realize that Hestia's power is cumulative. Repeated gestures, attentiveness, and ritualized care converge to create a stabilizing effect that no single dramatic act could achieve. And as you pause, watching a wisp of smoke curl upward, the delicate patterns of light on the floor, and the subtle adjustments of bowls and embers, the full scope of Hestia's influence becomes clear. Even in a world of mighty deities and volatile tempers, harmony is maintained not through thunder or command, but through quiet attentiveness, consistent ritual, and the thoughtful orchestration of small acts. It is a reminder that the softest, most deliberate interventions can have enduring power.
Deeper into the palace, and the atmosphere grows quieter, more deliberate. Here, Hestia's influence is almost invisible, yet everywhere you look, her quiet guidance shapes Olympus. Gods who might otherwise argue over precedence, power, or pride move with a subtle deference that you can almost feel in the air. You trudge along, noting how even minor interactions, passing an offering, adjusting a seat, the timing of a bow, reflect an internalized rhythm of respect. Historians still argue whether these accounts mirror ritualistic practices in human households or are allegorical illustrations of ideal domestic and social order. Either way, the subtle orchestration is undeniable. The hearth itself functions as both symbol and instrument. Flames crackle softly, light flickering over bronze and marble, and the scent of olive oil and incense carries through the hallways. Fringe accounts suggest that Hestia sometimes whispers a single word, a tone so soft it is nearly imperceptible, nudging a tense deity toward patience. You can almost see Ares' shoulders drop, Hermes' hands unclench, as the fire performs its quiet magic. This method is remarkably effective. Influence is exercised through repeated, gentle cues rather than force or spectacle. Small gestures carry enormous significance. A grain placed at the perfect angle, a bowl tilted just so, the careful alignment of offerings all reinforce a system of expectation.
Fringe traditions tell of mischievous spirits testing boundaries, moving objects, or adjusting the flame to provoke minor reactions, only to be subtly corrected by the goddess. You imagine the humor in this. Even immortals can be guided by the careful choreography of domestic ritual. Historians still argue whether these stories are purely symbolic or reflect some aspect of observed cult practice, but the principle remains clear. Attention to detail can stabilize behavior. You trudge through a chamber where minor deities gather, the placement of each figure meticulously following Hestia's rules. Proximity to the hearth indicates respect. Posture signals attentiveness, and even timing of gestures communicates hierarchy. Fringe sources suggest that these minor corrections, real or imagined, helped prevent conflicts before they escalated, teaching gods and mortals alike that harmony arises from cumulative, deliberate actions. The sensory environment reinforces calm. Crackling embers, subtle aromatic hints from incense or herbs, and shifting patterns of light combine to create an atmosphere conducive to attention, patience, and respect. Fringe tales claim that certain scents, lavender, thyme, or cinnamon, were intentionally employed to modulate temper or focus, offering a faint but pervasive nudge toward equilibrium. You trudge past, breathing in the complex, comforting mixture, realizing that these minor sensory cues are as critical to her governance as her more visible rituals. Even conversations are mediated subtly. Gods speak with measured tones, pausing instinctively when a flame flares or smoke curls unusually. Fringe legends describe minor corrections, a carefully tilted bowl or a nudge from a spirit reminding an overexcited god to slow down. Historians still argue whether these anecdotes reflect literal rituals, teaching tools, or mythic embellishments, but the cumulative effect portrayed in stories is undeniable. The hearth enforces calm through rhythm, repetition, and attention to detail, shaping social interactions without overt enforcement. You notice that humor and playfulness coexist with decorum. Slight disruptions, mischievous gestures, or playful variations are absorbed into the system, teaching flexibility within the rules of domestic order. Fringe accounts describe a nymph moving an ember to amuse a distracted god, prompting a laugh without threatening ritual structure. This dynamic illustrates Hestia's subtle genius. Influence need not be rigid, and even small deviations can reinforce attention when managed with patience. Walking past another set of carefully arranged offerings, you reflect on the cumulative strategy, daily attentiveness, ritualized care, sensory cues, minor corrections, and quiet mediation together create a stabilizing web that extends from the hearth into every interaction. Even gods accustomed to displays of raw power submit, consciously or not, to this invisible governance. And you feel, in this deliberate quiet, the remarkable lesson of Hestia's method. The most enduring authority is exercised gently, consistently, and with patience.
You linger now at the heart of Olympus, where Hestia's influence is most pervasive, yet simultaneously most subtle. The corridors hum with quiet order, and even the most tempestuous god seemed softened, attuned to rhythms you almost don't notice. You trudge past the hearth, its embers casting golden patterns across polished floors, and the scent of olive oil, honey, and faint incense mingles in the air. Historians still argue whether these accounts are literal depictions of ritual practices or symbolic reflections of domestic ideals, but the effect on the imagination is undeniable. Daily routines reinforce calm. You notice the timing of libations, grain sprinkled just so, a precise drizzle of honey, each motion deliberate, each gesture reinforcing hierarchy and attention.
Fringe traditions claim that a flicker of flame or a curling wisp of smoke can subtly redirect a distracted deity, and you imagine Hermes pausing mid-gesture as the fire seemingly commands respect. There is humor here, too. A mischievous spark nudging Harry's elbow just enough to avoid an accidental spill, reminding even immortals that order can be maintained with patience rather than force. Her methods rely on cumulative small actions. Each offering, each gesture of respect, each subtle intervention builds a network of influence that tempers and maintains harmony. Minor spirits assist silently, nudging objects or adjusting incense smoke, while the gods themselves internalize the rhythm of expectation. Fringe accounts suggest that even the smallest overlooked detail, an improperly aligned bowl or untended ember, could create ripple effects, gently corrected by Hestia's careful attention. Historians still debate whether such accounts represent real-world ritual practices or symbolic reflections of domestic ideals, but the effect on the imagination is undeniable. The hearth serves as a social and moral anchor. Proximity, posture, and timing communicate rank, attentiveness, and intention. Conversations proceed with measured cadence. Interruptions are softened by subtle cues from flame, smoke, or placement of objects. Fringe tales recount that even seemingly minor disturbances, playful pranks by nymphs or spirits, are resolved within this system, teaching both gods and mortals that humor and order can coexist. You trudge through this concept, recognizing that the stability of Olympus rests not on force, but on patience, attentiveness, and subtle orchestration. Sensory cues reinforce her authority. The crackle of embers, shifting light patterns, and aromatic combinations act together to create an environment conducive to calm. Fringe accounts suggest that specific herbs or incense were employed to subtly influence moods, while the rhythm of the fire teaches attentiveness and respect without confrontation. Even the gods' laughter, occasional smiles, or playful nudges are absorbed into the structure, reinforcing order with gentle, indirect guidance. As you move through this quiet space, you see that Hestia's governance is everywhere, yet unseen. The hearth, offerings, and rituals create a constant, pervasive rhythm. Minor corrections, whispered guidance, and subtle cues ensure that disputes are mitigated before they escalate. Fringe traditions hint that mortals observing these patterns learned lessons in decorum, patience, and domestic harmony, translating divine order into human practice. Historians still debate the literal versus symbolic aspects of these narratives, but the principle is clear. Small, deliberate acts accumulate to shape behavior and maintain peace. Even the grandest gods, whose tempers could rival storms, comply unconsciously. You notice Ares restraining his fist, Zeus moderating his tone, and Hermes adjusting his posture, all without direct instruction. Fringe stories describe the gentle nudging of a flame or the slight tilting of an offering to restore equilibrium, demonstrating that influence often works best when invisible and cumulative. The strategy is elegant. Consistent attention to minor details governs what might otherwise require forceful intervention. And now, as you pause near the hearth, absorbing the sensory and social choreography, the full scope of Hestia's mastery is evident. Her authority is exercised quietly, patiently, and continuously. The rhythm of daily ritual, the careful placement of objects, and the attentive guidance of both gods and spirits converge to maintain harmony. Even in a realm defined by tempests and grand personalities, peace persists through the gentle orchestration of small, deliberate acts. Finally, you take a deep breath, noting the soft hum of activity, the flicker of the flames, the subtle patterns of light and scent, and the calm authority that pervades every corner. The lesson of Hestia's method is clear. Influence is most enduring when it is subtle, patient, and carefully sustained, proving that even the mightiest beings are guided by the smallest acts of attentiveness.